In the autumn of 2011, the Slaughterhouse in Garrison County refused Silas Blackwood's hogs, all 24 of them. The refusal wasn't a negotiation. It was a final judgment, delivered on a laminated clipboard by a man half Silas's age, a man whose hands had never touched soil or swine. His name was Mark Hayes, and he was the regional logistics manager for Consolidated Meats, a corporation that processed 1,200 hogs an hour in a facility the size of a football stadium, all stainless steel and fluorescent light. Silas was 72 years old, had been raising hogs on the same 312 acres for 55 years, and was known for two things: never being late and never saying more than was necessary. He stood by his stock trailer, the morning chill still clinging to the valley floor, and listened. The 24 hogs, rustling and grunting softly behind him, were the culmination of a full year's work and 4 generations of breeding. Hayes tapped the clipboard with a clean, uncalloused finger. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice imbued with the patient certainty of a man who lives by data. "We can't take these. The back fat measurements are inconsistent. We're seeing readings anywhere from 1.8 to 2.3 inches. Our automated evisceration line is calibrated for a maximum of 1.1 inches. Your animals would cause a line stoppage. A single stoppage costs us $11,000 a minute." He paused, letting the number hang in the air between the growl of the refrigerated trucks and the lowing of distant cattle. "Furthermore, the fat-to-lean ratio is outside of acceptable parameters for our retail partners. The market wants lean. Loin eyes of at least 6 square inches with minimal intramuscular fat." Silas's grandson, Ben, stood beside him. Ben was 23, fresh out of the state university with a degree in agricultural business. He understood the language Hayes was speaking. He had studied the charts, the yield projections, the commodity futures. He felt a flush of embarrassment for his grandfather, for the old truck, for the hogs that were suddenly, quantifiably, obsolete. "He's talking about marbling, Grandpa," Ben said, his voice quiet. Silas looked at Hayes, then at the clipboard, then back at Hayes. He didn't look at Ben. His gaze was steady, his face a mask of weathered patience. The hogs he had brought were Blackwood hogs, a landrace breed his great-grandfather had started in 1888 from a mix of feral stock from the mountains and a few hardy Berkshire sows. They were not bred for uniformity, they were bred for survival. They were bred to thrive on the acorns and hickory nuts that fell in the 20-acre woodlot at the back of the property. They were bred for the cold winters and the humid summers of the Garrison Valley. The fat Hayes was calling a liability was, for 123 years, the very thing that made them valuable. It was flavor. It was preservation. It was currency. Hayes continued, his tone shifting from managerial to faintly sympathetic. "Look, I can see they're healthy animals, but they're just not industrial. Our system is built on standardization. Every hog has to be a near-perfect duplicate of the last. It's how we keep costs down for the consumer." He offered a thin smile. "It's progress, Mr. Blackwood." Silas finally spoke. His voice was gravelly, low, and carried no hint of argument. "What are you offering?" Hayes checked his clipboard again, though he knew the number. It was a formality. "Given the non-standard carcass, we'd have to process them manually, offline. The best I could do is classify them as utility grade. 28 cents a pound live weight." Ben did the math in his head. The hogs averaged 260 pounds. 24 hogs at 260 pounds each was 6,240 pounds. At 28 cents a pound, the total came to $1,747
It had cost them over $4,000 in supplemental feed and care over the past year, not counting their own labor.
It was less than an offer. It was an insult wrapped in the language of economics. The banknote on the farm, a balloon payment of $45,000, was due in 18 months. This money was meant to be a significant piece of that payment. Silas gave a single slow nod. He did not ask to speak to a supervisor. He did not haggle. He simply turned, walked to the cab of his 1987 Ford F250 and started the engine. The diesel engine rumbled to life with a plume of dark smoke. Ben stood frozen for a moment, caught between the world of his grandfather and the world represented by Mark Hayes. He looked at Hayes, who just shrugged as if to say, "I tried." Then Ben scrambled into the passenger seat as his grandfather put the truck in gear. The drive away from the Consolidated Meats facility was silent. The refusal, sharp and absolute, had created a vacuum. The question of what to do with 6,240 pounds of living, breathing liability filled the cab of the old truck. They drove the 7 miles back to the farm, the gravel crunching under the tyres as they turned down the long lane. The farm wasn't grand. A 100-year-old white farmhouse that needed paint, a big red barn whose roof was patched in 3 different shades of tin, and several smaller outbuildings. And then there was the spring house. To understand what Silas did next, you have to understand the spring house. Let me tell you about the spring house, because it is the heart of this story. It was built not by Silas's grandfather, but by his great-grandfather, Thomas Blackwood, in the year 1888. Thomas was a man who believed in stone. He had cleared the fields of them, piling them into the long, meandering fences that still marked the property lines. But the best stones, the flat, heavy granite ones, he saved. For 3 years, he and his 2 sons dug into the gentle slope behind the main house, following the path of a cold, constant spring that emerged from the hillside. They dug down 8 feet, creating a rectangular pit 15 feet wide and 25 feet long. They laid a foundation of massive stones, some weighing 500 pounds, and then they began to build the walls. The walls were 3 feet thick, 2 layers of carefully fitted granite with a rubble-filled core. There was no mortar in the modern sense, just a clay and lime mixture that Thomas made himself. They built the stone walls up to a height of 6 feet, then capped them with enormous timber beams cut from the property's own oak trees. The roof was slate, thick and grey, angled steeply to shed snow. Inside, the spring house was a different world. The air was always cool, holding at a steady 54 degrees Fahrenheit, whether it was a 95-degree day in July or 10 degrees in January. The spring itself was the key. Thomas had channeled it. It entered through a small, arched opening in the back wall and flowed through a trough carved into the stone floor, running the length of the building before exiting through another opening in the front. The constant flow of 40-degree water acted as a natural refrigerant, keeping the room's temperature and humidity in a perfect, unwavering state of equilibrium. There were no windows. The only light came from the heavy oak door. The air smelled of damp earth, of cold stone, and of something else. The faint, lingering ghosts of salt and hickory smoke. This was not just a place for storing milk and butter. This was a place of transformation. For 4 generations, the Blackwood family had used this stone room to cure their meat. It was here that the fat, the very thing Mark Hayes had dismissed, became something transcendent. The process was a ritual, a science passed down not in textbooks, but in calloused hands and quiet observation. It was a calendar of salt, smoke, and time. When they got back to the farm, Silas backed the trailer up to the hog pen and unloaded the animals. They grunted, happy to be back on familiar ground. Ben got out of the truck, the silence stretching between him and his grandfather. Finally, Ben couldn't hold it in. "So, what now? We just lost a year's profit. We can't take them to the auction in Greencastle. They'll give us even less. Maybe I should call the guy from the university extension."
He was talking about a New Yorkshire cross that has amazing feed conversion ratios. Silas ignored the question. He walked over to the spring house. The oak door was hung on massive iron hinges his great-grandfather had forged himself. It was secured not by a lock, but by a heavy iron bar that dropped into two stone brackets. He lifted the bar, its weight familiar in his hands, and pulled the door open. A wave of cool, earthy air washed over them. He stood there for a long moment, looking into the darkness. Then he turned to Ben.
"We'll do it the old way," he said. It was not a suggestion, it was a declaration. Ben was aghast. "What are you talking about? All of them? That's over 6,000 pounds of hog. We haven't cured more than 2 or 3 a year since Grandma died. We don't have the salt, we don't have the time. The banknote is due, Grandpa. We need cash flow, not a hobby." Silas looked at his grandson, and for the first time, Ben saw a flicker of something other than patience in his eyes. It was a deep, unyielding certainty. "Your education taught you the price of things," Silas said, his voice even. "It didn't teach you the value. Go get the truck. We're going to town for salt." And so it began. The process was a brutal, physically demanding affair. Silas, at 72, worked with the steady, efficient rhythm of a man who had done this his entire life. Ben, strong and young, was clumsy by comparison, his movements jerky and uncertain. They slaughtered the first 4 hogs themselves, right there on the farm. It was a bloody, visceral business that took 2 full days. They saved everything: the blood for sausage, the intestines for casings, the organs for the table. But the prime cuts, the hams, the shoulders, the bellies, were destined for the spring house. Let me tell you about the salt. Silas didn't just buy any salt. He drove 40 miles to a specific feed mill that still sold pure, coarse sea salt in 100-pound burlap sacks with no iodine or anti-caking agents. He bought 1,000 pounds of it. He and Ben poured it into the salt box in the corner of the spring house. This was not just any box. It was made from a single, hollowed-out poplar log, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, that Silas's grandfather had made. It was over 80 years old. The wood was saturated with the salt and fat of decades of curing. It was an ecosystem in itself. The process for each ham was precise. Each fresh ham, weighing between 28 and 32 pounds, was laid on a thick wooden table. Silas would take handfuls of the coarse salt and rub it into the meat, working it deep into every crevice, around the bone, under the skin. He used a specific pressure, a specific motion he had learned from his father, who had learned it from his. The salt was not just a preservative, it was a catalyst. It began to draw the water out of the cells, changing the very structure of the muscle and fat. Once thoroughly salted, the hams were laid in the salt box, skin side down, and buried completely in salt. They would stay there for 1 day per pound of weight. A 30-pound ham stayed in the salt for 30 days. While the first batch of hams cured in the salt box, Silas and Ben processed the rest of the hogs. They repeated the slaughtering and butchering process 5 more times over the next 2 weeks, until all 24 hogs were processed. The farm's freezers were filled with chops and roasts. They made hundreds of pounds of sausage, seasoned with sage and pepper from recipes that were not written down anywhere.
But the 48 hams, the 48 shoulders, and the long, thick slabs of belly bacon were the true prize. They filled the salt box, cycled through it, and were then hung from the massive oak beams of the spring house ceiling. After the salt cure came the equalization. The hams were washed of excess salt and hung in the cool, dark air of the spring house for another 60 days. During this time, the salt that had penetrated the outer layers of the meat slowly, patiently distributed itself evenly throughout the entire ham. The meat began to firm up, the color deepening from pink to a rich, dusky rose. The fat, that glorious thick layer of white fat, began to turn translucent at the edges. Ben watched all of this with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. His business degree screamed at him that this was insane.
The inventory was just sitting there, hanging in the dark, tying up capital. There was no cash flow. He would run projections in his head at night. The cost of the salt, $650. The cost of the supplemental feed they had already spent, $4,200. The value of their own labor, which he calculated at the state minimum wage. The farm was bleeding money, slowly and quietly, in the cool 54-degree air of the spring house. He argued with Silas one evening. "Grandpa, we have to sell the sausage, at least. We can take it to the farmer's market. It's something. We're sitting on thousands of pounds of meat while the bank is sending us letters." Silas was sitting at the kitchen table, sharpening one of his butchering knives on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. He didn't look up. "The sausage is for us. The hams are for the bank." "The hams won't be ready for another year. The bank wants its money in 16 months. What if this doesn't work?" What if nobody wants to buy 100-year-old ham? Silas stopped sharpening. He looked at the blade, testing its edge with his thumb. He looked at Ben. "It's not about what they want, it's about what we have. We don't have lean hogs calibrated for a machine. We have time, we have salt, we have smoke. We have this place." He gestured with his head toward the spring house. "We use what we have." After the 60-day equalization period came the smoke. This too was a ritual. Let me tell you about the smoke. Silas used only hickory cut from their own woodlot, not just any hickory. It had to be wood from trees that were at least 50 years old, felled in the winter when the sap was down, and seasoned for a minimum of 3 years. The logs were split into small, precise pieces. The fire was built not in the spring house itself, but in a small stone firebox 20 feet away, connected to the spring house by an underground stone-lined flue. This was a cold smoking process. The smoke that entered the spring house was never warmer than 60 degrees. It was a cool, fragrant vapor, not a hot, cooking smoke. For 90 straight days, from December through February, Silas tended that fire. He would start a small, smoldering fire of hickory chips and sawdust in the pre-dawn darkness. It would produce a steady, thin stream of blue-gray smoke that would travel through the flue and fill the spring house, swirling around the hanging hams. The smoke would run for 4 hours. Then he would let it die out, and the hams would rest in the smoke-filled air for the next 20 hours. Then he would do it again, every single day, for 90 days. Ben helped. He learned the smell of good smoke. He learned the difference between a smoldering fire and one that was too hot. He learned the patience of it. The smoke was another layer of preservation, another layer of flavor. It kept insects away. It imparted a deep, mahogany color to the skin of the hams. And it infused the fat with a sweet, nutty aroma that was impossible to describe. After the smoking, the final stage began. Aging. The hams were now hard to the touch, significantly lighter than when they started, having lost nearly 30% of their weight in water. Each one was wrapped in cheesecloth to protect it from dust and hung back up on the oak beams. And then they waited for 1 full year. During that year, the world outside the spring house continued on its own accelerated pace. The bank sent more letters, each one more insistent than the last. Ben took a part-time job at the local hardware store to bring in some cash for groceries and gas. Neighbors, who had heard about Silas refusing to sell his hogs and embarking on this mad project, would stop by. They meant well. They'd shake their heads and say, "Silas, you've got to be practical. That's a lot of meat to be sitting on. Why not just sell it fresh?" But inside the spring house, a slow, quiet magic was at work. Enzymes within the meat were breaking down the proteins into amino acids, creating complex flavors. The fat, that beautiful, thick, acorn-fed fat, was undergoing its own transformation. Its lipids breaking down into aromatic compounds that would give the final product its unique, nutty, buttery flavor. A fine, powdery blue-green mold began to grow on the outside of the hams, a sign that the aging process was proceeding correctly. It was a living product, breathing the cool, damp air of the stone room. Time was the final, most important ingredient, and it could not be rushed. The 18 months passed. It was now the spring of 2013. The banknote was due in 30 days. The final demand letter had arrived. It gave them until May 1st to pay the $45,000, or the foreclosure process would begin on the farm that had been in their family since 1875. They had managed to scrape together $12,000. They were $33,000 short. On a cool Saturday morning in late April, Silas walked to the spring house.
Ben followed him. Silas opened the heavy oak door. The air that rolled out was dense with the aroma of aged meat, salt, smoke, and earth. It was a smell that was both deeply complex and profoundly simple. It smelled of patience. Silas took a long pole with a hook on the end and carefully took down one of the hams. It was dark, almost black on the outside, covered in its fine coat of benevolent mold. It was hard as a rock. It weighed 22.7 pounds, down from its original 31.5. Silas carried it to the kitchen. He placed it on the big butcher block table that had also been in the family for a century. With a stiff brush, he cleaned off the mold. Then, with a long, thin, razor-sharp knife, he made the first cut. He sliced away the hard, dry outer layer, the pellicle, revealing the meat beneath. The colour was astonishing, a deep, translucent ruby red, streaked with intricate webs of creamy white fat. The fat itself was not the stark, solid white of industrial pork. It was a warm ivory colour, and it glistened under the kitchen light. Silas sliced a piece of the ham. The slice was so thin it was almost transparent. He handed it to Ben. Ben hesitated. For 18 months, this project had been a source of anxiety, of doubt, of conflict. He had seen it as his grandfather's stubborn refusal to adapt to the modern world. Now, he held a piece of that refusal in his hand. He put it in his mouth. The texture was the first surprise. It was not chewy or tough. It melted on his tongue. And then the flavour arrived. It was not just salty. It was a cascade of sensations, a deep, savoury meatiness, followed by a sweet, nutty flavour from the acorns and the hickory smoke, and a final, lingering, buttery finish from the fat. It was unlike any pork he had ever tasted. It tasted of the woods, of the stone spring house, of the smoke, of the long, patient months of waiting. It tasted of everything the man on the clipboard with the data had said was worthless.
In that moment, Ben understood. He understood his grandfather was not living in the past. He was preserving a future. But understanding did not pay the bank. They had 47 more of these magnificent hams, but no market. The question of value remained. The answer arrived in a dusty Subaru. Silas had an old friend, Arthur Vance, who owned a small, well-regarded restaurant in a city 60 miles away. Arthur was one of the few who hadn't questioned Silas's project. He just said, "Call me when they're ready." Silas had called him. Arthur said he'd be down on Saturday. He didn't say he was bringing anyone with him. The man who got out of the car with Arthur was tall, thin, and wore glasses. His name was Julian Croft, and he was a senior food critic for a major metropolitan newspaper, a man whose reviews could make or break a restaurant. Arthur introduced him simply as, "My friend Julian." Silas, ever taciturn, just nodded and invited them in. He didn't put on a show. He led them to the kitchen, where the ham still sat on the butcher block. He sliced 2 more paper-thin pieces and offered them to the visitors. Arthur Vance ate his piece, closed his eyes, and smiled a broad, genuine smile.
Silas, he said, his voice full of reverence. My God. Julian Croft was more analytical. He held the slice of ham up to the light, observing the way the fat had marbled the muscle. He smelled it, taking in the complex aroma. Then he placed it in his mouth. He did not close his eyes. He stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable as he let the flavors unfold. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he looked at Silas. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Raised it," Silas said. "Where did you cure it?" "In a spring house out back." Croft walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the small slate-roofed stone building. He seemed to be connecting the taste in his mouth with the sight of the old stone structure. He turned back. "What do you call it?" Silas looked nonplussed. "Ham." Then, seeing an opportunity, stepped forward. "We call it Blackwood Heritage Cure," he said, the name coming to him in a flash of inspiration. Croft nodded slowly. He looked at the ham on the table, then at Silas. "I have had jamón ibérico de bellota from Spain. I have had prosciutto di Parma aged for 36 months. I have had culatello from Zibello. This," he said, pointing at the ham, "is on that level. It may be beyond it. The fat structure is like nothing I've ever encountered." He paused. "How much do you want for it?" The question hung in the air. Silas had never sold a ham in his life, only live hogs. He had no frame of reference. The price Consolidated Meats had offered him, 28 cents a pound, echoed in his mind. He looked at Ben. Ben's mind was racing. He had spent the last few nights frantically researching the market for artisanal cured meats, a world he hadn't even known existed a year and a half ago. The prices he saw had staggered him. He took a breath, his heart pounding. He thought of the bank, of the foreclosure notice, of the 18 months of hard, uncertain labor. He named a price that felt both insane and utterly justified. $100 a pound, Ben said. Arthur Vance's eyebrows shot up. Silas's expression did not change. Julian Croft looked at Ben, then at Silas, then back at the ham. He showed no surprise. He simply nodded again, as if the number made perfect sense. "I'll take this one," he said, "and I'd like to purchase 3 more just like it." The ham on the table was 22.7 pounds. At $100 a pound, that was $2,270. 4 hams would be nearly $9,000. It was a fraction of what they needed, but it was a start. It was validation. The check he wrote was for $9,150, but that check was not the real climax of the story. The real climax came 2 weeks later. Julian Croft's review was published not in the food section, but on the front page of the Sunday paper. It was not just a review of a piece of meat. It was a 3,000-word story about Silas, about the Blackwood Hogs, about the 125-year-old spring house, and about the long, slow battle against an industrial system that valued speed and uniformity over flavor and tradition. He called the ham a masterpiece of American agriculture, a time capsule of flavor that stands as a quiet rebuke to the modern food system. The phone started ringing on Sunday morning and did not stop. It was chefs from New York, from Chicago, from San Francisco. It was specialty food distributors. It was television producers. They didn't ask the price. They asked how many hams they could get and how soon. Ben, the ag business major, became the business manager overnight. He created a waiting list. He explained that the hams took 18 months to cure, that supply was extremely limited. This only increased the demand. The price did not stay at $100 a pound. It rose to $120, then $150. The shoulders, which they cured in the same way, sold for $80 a pound. The bacon, thick slabs of it, sold for $40 a pound. They sold 10 hams in the first week, then 20. By the middle of May, they had sold all 48 hams, all 48 shoulders, and every strip of bacon. The total revenue was just over $280,000. After paying the bank the $45,000, Silas Blackwood, the man whose hogs were worth only $1,747.20 to the industrial system, had nearly $250,000 in his bank account. Let me tell you about the aftermath across the years. The Blackwood farm did not become a factory. Silas and Ben did not scale up. They couldn't. The spring house had a fixed capacity. The land could only support a certain number of hogs without destroying the ecosystem of the woodlot. They raised 24 hogs the next year and 24 the year after that. They kept a few more sows and eventually leveled out at raising 40 hogs a year. It was the number the land told them was right.
Ben never went back to the hardware store. He became the keeper of the legacy. He learned the rhythms of the seasons, the language of the hogs, the secrets of the spring house. He learned to mend the stone fences his great-great-grandfather had built. He married a local girl, and they had 2 children who grew up gathering acorns for the pigs. One day, about 2 years after the review was published, a shiny new pickup truck drove down the gravel lane. The man who got out was Mark Hayes from Consolidated Meats. He looked different in a polo shirt and slacks than he had in his work clothes and hard hat. He looked smaller. He approached Silas, who was sitting on the porch. Ben came out to stand next to his grandfather. Hayes was holding a glossy brochure. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, avoiding eye contact, "we've been following your success. It's quite a story. We've started a new artisanal division, a heritage line. We're looking for suppliers who can provide unique, high-quality products. We'd be prepared to offer you a contract, a guaranteed price of $5 per pound, live weight, for every hog you can raise for us." Ben almost laughed. He did the math. A 260-pound hog at $5 a pound would be $1,300. That same hog, after 18 months in the spring house, yielded product worth over $7,000. The industrial system's best offer was still less than 20% of the value Silas created by ignoring it. Silas looked at Hayes. He remembered the laminated clipboard, the judgment, the casual dismissal. He remembered the phrase, "It's progress." He could have said 1,000 things. He could have gloated. He could have lectured. He said only one thing. "We're not for sale." Hayes nodded, defeated. He got back in his truck and drove away. He was a man who understood numbers, and the numbers no longer added up in his favor. His system, built for speed and volume, could not produce the one thing that had made the Blackwood farm successful: authenticity. It could not manufacture a story. It could not build a 125-year-old spring house. It could not replicate 4 generations of accumulated wisdom. The story of Silas Blackwood's ham is not really about ham. It's about a different kind of economy. The modern world is built on the principle of scalable efficiency. It seeks to remove variance, to standardize, to accelerate. It replaces deep, specific local knowledge with broad, general, systemic data. It is a system that would look at a Blackwood hog and see only a liability: too much fat, too much variance, too slow to grow. It would look at a stone spring house and see only an inefficient, obsolete structure. It cannot measure the value of patience. It cannot assign a dollar amount to the flavor imparted by a specific forest floor. What Silas Blackwood knew in his bones was that the things the system called weaknesses were in fact his only true strengths. The fat was where the flavor was stored. The variance was the mark of authenticity. The slowness was the process by which value was created. He did not fight the system.
He did not argue with it. He simply refused its terms and turned to a different system, an older one, based on the immutable logic of stone, salt, smoke, and time. The world will tell you to be leaner, to be faster, to be more uniform. It will present you with data on a laminated clipboard and call it truth. But value is not always found in efficiency. Sometimes it is found in the things that cannot be scaled. Sometimes the liability is the asset. And sometimes the most profitable thing you can do is the slow, patient, and difficult work of being precisely and unapologetically yourself.